story that I like to tell when I'm talking about our archive. In mid-November 2017, Pablo Mauret, who is an Argentinian essayist and was then a professor of literature at a small Midwestern college, tweeted, at no one in particular, his intention to reread Dante's Divine Comedy, one canto per day, for the first 100 days of the new year in 2018. Within a few weeks, that tweet had mobilized a mass of fellow readers across the Spanish-speaking world. They used the hashtag Dante 2018, and as they read, Twitter users posted quotations, comments, links, graffiti, illustrations, and photos, often selfies, as they progressed collectively through the poem. Copies of the Divina Commedia were flying off the shelves in Buenos Aires, while illustrators, designers, and performers generated and circulated works inspired by and responding to their reading. Mauret estimates that several thousand Twitter users from across 5 continents participated in the reading over those first 100 days, making Dante and his comedy one of early 2018's hottest trending topics across Latin America. The unlikely virality of hashtag Dante 2018 speaks to the broad and deep global resonance of Dante's 14th century epic poem. And so our digital archival project, Dante Today, Sightings and Sightings of Dante's Works in Contemporary Culture, you can see the pun in the subheading there at the bottom of the slide, seeks to capture and promote the effects of this resonance as Dante's works echo within, across, and against contemporary cultures. I co-direct the project with Ariel Saber of Johns Hopkins University. She founded the site in 2006. And we work with the support of IT staff, digital humanities specialists, and students, mostly undergraduates, but also now a few graduate students from each of our home institutions. Our team's work serves 2 distinct ends. So on the one hand, we see ourselves as preserving a set of cultural ephemera that, if not collected, would otherwise pass unnoticed or even disappear. And on the other hand, we bear witness to an otherwise undocumented global conversation among contemporary artists and writers who utilize Dante's works as a lens through which to describe, analyze, and critique the contemporary world as they see it. Our archive makes visible an invisible transnational exchange that's mediated through this shared cultural touchstone. The Commedio's stamp on modern culture is far-reaching, and in many spheres it's well documented. There's a growing and critical body of scholarship that testifies to the broad, but not always deep, imprint that the Commedia has left on Anglo-European literature, cinema, visual arts and architecture, even comic books and graphic novels. But Dante's reach extends far beyond the borders of the Anglo-European world, just as it extends beyond what I tend to think of as sanctioned categories of reference, or sanctioned genres. Far fewer studies have investigated Dante's ubiquity across the artifacts of global mass cultures, in advertisements or in street art, in internet memes or on social media, on restaurant menus or in place names, in album titles and song lyrics. As hashtag Dante 2018 makes clear, Dante and his Inferno are everywhere and trending. So the website Dante Today aims to serve as a single reference point for all of these engagements, from the most learned forms of high culture to the most superficial forms of mass culture. We've designed Dante Today as a crowdsourced and curated digital repository that catalogs references to Dante and his works across 20th and 21st century cultures. And we're currently in the process of redesigning the site's infrastructure. We're working with the web design team at the firm Studio Rainwater to recreate the site. We're updating its user interface, enhancing its search capabilities. We've hired a team of student researchers. This is just a quick shot of the screenshot of the new homepage. We've hired a team of student researchers to assist with the data migration, but we have to do that migration by hand. And so it's extremely laborious because of the increased capabilities of the new site. And so again, there's a question about data management that I think is an interesting one for digital humanists to be thinking about. We expect to relaunch the new site in January 2025. But in the meantime, I'll tell you about the site's current design, all of which will be retained in the new site but presented newly. So at present, the Dante site is divided into 7 pages. There is the home page, the submit a citing form. It includes a submission form. There's a page of relevant Dante-related links, a public and open bibliography of over 400 scholarly resources on Dante's reception across medias, genres, and languages and cultures. This is actually something that I'm particularly proud of. We built a public Zotero library, so any user can go and consult this resource. People can submit additional resources for us to add to the bibliography. It's always growing. It's definitely not complete. There's, of course, a user's guide, as you might expect, a page of resources for teachers, which sorely needs updating, and an about page where we credit all of our collaborators. Each post in the archive shows a title, an image, a brief quotation or description, a category, which you can see at the bottom, and tags, which you can see below those. And all of the information in the post is hyperlinked to other sources, either inside or outside of the site. And so all the images and their descriptions can be traced back to their original online sources. In the right-hand sidebar, you see the search bar. There's also the most frequent tags. There's a full page of the most frequent tags that are organized into a tag cloud. And there are lists to links to the full list of tags and to the map of sightings, which looks very cool on the new site. I'd be really happy to show it off. All the posts are curated by our research team, but they're also very importantly crowdsourced. So we receive submissions through the Submit a Citing form from students and teachers, both in high schools and in higher ed, as well as artists, writers, scholars, curators, performers, marketers, and other fans of Dante's works around the world. Once submissions are received, we tag, map, and categorize them. And you can see the current list of categories on the home page, although this is going to change in the new setup because we're building a search and filter system that allows users to narrow in even more closely on the data that they're looking for. So aside from our general categories and tags, we avoid imposing any kind of classifications onto the references. Because our primary objective in the archive has been to document the global reception of Dante's works, Saber and I have chosen not to provide any kind of expert commentary on the artifacts in the collection, nor to enable the participation of users through upvoting, liking, or commenting on a specific post, on an individual post. We really think of our work strictly as that of archivists, who carefully select the objects to be included in the collection, thoughtfully devise their descriptions, and then step aside to let our users determine how they will engage with them, and to engage with them as they choose to, through features like the search bar, the tag list, etc., each visitor using his or her own metrics to analyze the data, to analyze the ways that these artifacts use Dante's works to comment on contemporary culture. So like I said, we've chosen not to classify references according to things like depth or accuracy. We don't assess the fidelity of a reference to the original poem. To put it simply, fidelity and depth are not the only measures that matter in the analysis of these data, if you ask me. I'll use a well-known and much discussed example, which is the Dante's Inferno video game. The video game might engage deeply with the original poem. It's a full playable experience of Dante's Inferno, but its accuracy is up for debate, what with its crusader pilgrim and his damsel in distress Beatrice, neither of which apply to the original poem. Does that matter to the way that we evaluate the game's efficacy or worth in our research questions or in our classrooms? Really depends on the question that the classroom wants to pose. Let's contrast that example with the fact that the 5th episode of HBO's television series Westworld is titled Contrapasso, a term that comes directly out of Dante's Inferno, which many scholars and teachers use as shorthand for describing the entire system of justice in Dante's Inferno. The episode makes no other explicit mention of Dante, and so is the video game, for all of its depth, any more interesting or relevant to the question of Dante's resonance in contemporary culture than the title of a TV episode? We have our own thoughts, our own practices, our own pedagogies, but we leave this question up to our users to determine. We do, however, do a great deal of curating for the site, mostly consisting of asking ourselves the question, is this really a reference to Dante and to his works? So I'll give another example, which is one of my favorites. The Simpsons episode Treehouse of Horror 4, which aired in 1993. It was season 5 of The Simpsons. In the episode, Homer bargains his soul for a donut. When he caves into temptation and eats the donut, of course, a devilish Ned Flanders swoops him off to hell, where he's sent to what they call the ironic punishment division of Hell Labs. In perfect Dantesque retribution, Homer is forced by the devil to binge eat thousands of pink glazed donuts, which he does gleefully much to the devil's consternation. So that's where curation comes in. There's no direct reference to Dante in the episode, but the very idea of an ironic punishment that's meant to reveal something of the nature of the crime itself, like Homer's gluttony, comes to American popular culture directly through the influence of Dante's poem. So the curatorial team of the site, which is comprised of Saber and me, along with small teams of mostly undergraduate research assistants from each of our respective institutions, collaborate to discover, research, and identify clear references to the poet or to his works. So our small team is then privy to a great number of narratives and argumentative threads that are hidden in the archive. And I could go on and on about the amazing research projects that my students have done to contribute more to the archive. Up to this point, though, our hands-off approach has left the work of uncovering those narratives squarely in the hands of the user. So one of our future initiatives seeks to address this. Hopefully this will happen, but we're in talks with the design team about developing a virtual gallery within the space of the site, which would begin to do some of the work of parsing the materials that are held in the collection. So we've amassed more than 2,000 artifacts. We feel like it's become more necessary, especially as we grow, not to bombard the user with just a mass of artifacts, and instead to give users access to some of those narratives that are embedded in the archive's collection, all the while hoping to inspire them to do their own digging. So we think of our archive a lot like a museum collection in which various stories are concealed, like the one with which I began my talk, Dante 2018. As it stands, each of these artifacts can only be discovered through a brief post, through tags, or through search. So our gallery would draw out those narratives, much like a museum's featured exhibit space, which draws from its general collection and from outside materials to present specific narratives that hide in the large collection. Within the next 2 years, fingers crossed, we'll create the gallery, establish an editorial board, solicit guest curators, etc. So one of our first exhibits, hopefully, will feature my conversations with the poet Lorna Goodison, who I spoke about yesterday. For those of you that weren't there, Goodison is a world-renowned, prize-winning poet. She's the former poet laureate of Jamaica. Her poems are frequently anthologized in collections of world literature or world poetry. And Goodison has embarked on a series of tradaptations of Dante's poem, a project which builds on her career-long dialogue with the medieval poet. So my research on Goodison's work could well become a written essay. This is just a snippet of Canto 1. I'd ask that no one cite or circulate this image without Goodison's explicit permission. This is unpublished as of yet. My research on Goodison's work could well become, and I hope it does become, a written essay that I would submit to a traditional academic journal. But it's here that I see the potential for a new publishing platform. If I were to instead design a virtual exhibit dedicated to Goodison's engagement with Dante, I could include her paintings and drawings. She's an equally accomplished visual artist. I could include audio that features her reading her poems in her very distinct Jamaican cadence, in Jamaican patois. I could include video clips of interviews and lectures that would otherwise be merely transcribed into text. A multimedia exhibit on Goodison's work would include embedded audio and video of the poet reading and discussing aspects of her poetry. It could include maps and photographs of the places she describes, hyperlinks to additional information or additional resources connected to aspects of Jamaican culture that she documents, as well as the text of some of the poems themselves. So we're meeting with Studio Rainwater, our contracted design firm, next week to talk about our plans for the gallery, and they're excited to build it for us. So the next step, beyond developing the content of the exhibits, obviously, is to apply for funding from large national bodies to be able to contract with them to build the gallery's infrastructure. And again, funding is a really important question in DH projects, which we might return to in the discussion. Okay, so I talked about how the archive has been set up and how we might imagine its use in a classroom or by a reader, a student, a scholar. Now I'm going to turn to a demonstration of the kind of analysis that I think can be enabled by this archive's holdings. So to do so, I'm going to turn to one of my own current research threads, which is on Dante memes. And this will be the second part of my talk. So in my research, I'm invested in making sense of how Dante enters into global popular imaginaries, especially even in the trivial, reductive, superficial, sometimes totally inaccurate ways that he does. It may come as no surprise, I think it's stating the obvious, but through my archival work, I have clear quantitative evidence that the primary way in which Dante's work resonates in and across contemporary mass cultures, especially in the US, but also around the world, is through Inferno-based memes. So in using that term meme, I'm referring to Richard Dawkins' original coinage of the term in his 1976 classic, The Selfish Gene, where he introduces the concept of the meme to trace what he calls, quote, units of cultural transmission that, quote, propagate themselves in the meme pool by leaping from brain to brain via a process which, in the broad sense, can be called imitation, end quote. Such units of cultural transmission for Dawkins can be, quote, tunes, ideas, catchphrases, clothes fashions, ways of making pots or of building arches, end quote. Now, since Dawkins' original coinage of the term, almost 50 years ago now, it's been applied to a variety of cultural artifacts, especially so-called internet memes, which of course we all know, traditionally defined as static images with superimposed block format text, like this one featuring hipster Stefano. And I could talk about hipster Stefano all day. I should also mention that all of the internet memes that I use in my slides and elsewhere in my work, they're all found images. I haven't created any of these memes. So I'm using the term meme here in that broader sense, to think about what's been described as the logics of memetic thinking in the digital age, along the lines of the work of meme theorists like Henry Jenkins, Lemore Schiffman, and Ryan Milner. Milner, for whom memes are, quote, strands of creative play in public conversation, end quote. According to Lemore Schiffman, who is one of the most prominent meme theorists, cultural artifacts tend to become memes through several factors. She notes that they are simple, repetitive, repeatable, humorous, and incomplete, presenting a puzzle or a problem, in need of user participation to find its resolution. So in my research, I'm seeking to identify what memes have emerged out of Dante's work, especially but not exclusively from his Inferno. So I'm looking at the units of cultural transmission that have become, as Milner says, strands of creative play in public conversation. I'm looking, in other words, at the endlessly adaptable, manipulable components of the poem that have been picked up and played with by users, not necessarily readers, of the poem, and which represent the primary points of entry into the worlds of the poem that exist today. So these elements tend to follow Schiffman's criteria: simple, repetitive, repeatable, humorous, and incomplete. So in my work as archivist on Dante Today, I've begun to identify memetic threads among users of Dante's poem across contemporary media. And I've thus far organized these into 5 different strands of memetic logic that have been applied to Dante's poem, extracting from it cultural units that can then be repurposed across different media. So in the book project, I plan to consider, in turn, uses of the poet's name, title, and visage, which may adorn pizza parlor menus, beer labels, t-shirts, street art, rock band merchandise, educational platforms, even a short-lived cryptocurrency. I'm going to look at appropriations of the very idea of an idiosyncratic vision of hell, i.e. that this is Dante's Inferno, but we might also find, say, Jimbo's Inferno, or an Inferno for moms, or singles, or academics. I'm going to turn attention to references to the topography of Dante's hell, the idea of the circle of hell, or special place in hell, or to the newly discovered 10th circle, forgotten or ignored in Dante's vision of hell. I'll look at references to his most famous and most adaptable characters, figures like Virgil, Francesca, Beatrice, figures whose stories are reimagined in what can essentially be described as fan fictions. Lastly, I'll consider citations and misquotations of Dante's verses, topped, of course, by the phrase, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here," which, along with some other quotations and misquotations, has been rendered an essentially authorless maxim of contemporary life in the US and beyond. So I think of all of these as memes because of the ways that these units are easily culled from the poem, from the universe of the poem, and then glide away from it in an endless drift, eventually unmooring themselves from their basis in Dante's work and reintegrating themselves into new cultural fabrics and new vernaculars, both verbal and visual. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, that reintegration has been the subject of many recent studies on Dante's reception, especially in light of the celebrations of the 7th centenary of the poet's death in 2021. Nearly all of the major interventions in the field of Dante reception in recent years have addressed the ways in which elite readers have creatively responded to the poem, adapting, translating, illustrating it from a position of long and deep study. That focus on elite reading of Dante's works has dominated not only scholarship and teaching on the impact of Dante's poem in contemporary high culture predominantly, but also assertions of the value of the poet's cultural interventions. So commentators have historically framed Dante and his works as containing arcane mysteries that require a particular kind of expertise in order to access them. I hope to counter that narrative by showcasing the compelling, if not always accurate, ways in which his poem enters the American popular imaginary, the popular imaginaries in the US and elsewhere, let's say. So in doing so, my work hopes to present a critical counterpoint to the general scholarly consensus around Dante's hypercanonical status and the global heritage of his poem, uncovering modes of engagement with the poem that approach it from a position of, on the one hand, ignorance, and on the other hand, resistance. So with the time that I have remaining, I want to turn briefly to an example of the kind of work that I've been doing in my search for this popular mimetic engagement. So after initially tracking Dante's mimetic output in what was frankly a fairly haphazard fashion, I was mostly just using Google searches and generated a lot of material that way, like hundreds and hundreds of things that way. But I began to get interested in how I could quantify the dissemination of these memes in the contemporary Anglo-American vernacular. In what circumstances does the average English speaker turn, for example, to Dante's topography of hell to criticize some aspect of contemporary life? How often do we use Dante's dark wood, as in these cases, in lamenting the crossroads or the turning points of our lives? When do we turn to the circles of hell to express our frustrations when our world and the people in it fail to live up to our expectations? So to examine the diffusion of these memes across contemporary vernaculars, I decided to look at data culled from the social media site formerly known as Twitter. So I'm thinking of tweets as a proxy for the measure of this diffusion across everyday speech. Twitter, of course, no longer exists. It's now known as X, and that change is a significant one. It has impacted the data from my project in ways that I couldn't have foreseen when I started collecting them, and I'll return to those changes really briefly at the end. So I originally started collecting data from Twitter in 2018 using a simple automated search tool called Twitter Archiving Google Sheets, or tags, which would crawl Twitter for certain phrases. So through tags, users could enter a term into a search box and generate an archive of the occurrences of that term on Twitter, and then have tags automatically run the search on Twitter every hour on the hour and store the results in a massive Google Sheet. So I've run a number of searches since our former digital humanities librarian at FSU, Sarah Stanley, first turned me on to tags in 2018. And I've generated a few different data sets that show some, what I think are pretty revealing results. So here's a list of the search terms that I was using and their numbers over the course of 1 year, September 5th, 2021 to September 5th, 2022. So Sarah, our former digital humanities librarian, and I are still working out ways to read and process all the data that we gathered through these searches. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over much of the material that we gathered, but suffice it to say that the tags results varied widely, and there were surprises in each data set that I'd be happy to go into if there's interest. I'll give you a taste of what a couple of our searches uncovered, just to show how I'm thinking through the question of how to quantify Dante memes in our contemporary vernacular. So, in the interest of time, I'm going to remark briefly on two searches. First, Abandon All Hope, which over the course of the year had produced 20,418 hits, of which 7,180 cited the full verse in what has become the canonical English translation, Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. And that's with the comma and without the comma. So an additional handful gave it as Abandon all hope, you who enter here, but the much more canonical English translation is ye, which seems to have originated with Chardi, whose translation remains the most frequently reprinted, especially in those like cheap paperback versions that you can pick up in any used bookstore. It's always a Chardi translation that you can find. And that's Chardi's translation of the line, so I think that's where the meme comes from. So compared to some of the other memes that I've been tracking, relatively few of these made any explicit reference to Dante or to the poem's title, but some acknowledge the quote's connection to the gates of hell. Users frequently play creatively with the quote, giving it as, abandon all hope, ye who didn't live through the 1980s, ye who play this game, ye who have female avatars, ye who overcook noodles. Some users change its location, abandon all hope, ye who enter my laundry pile, ye who enter this profession, or ye who enter America, Rio de Janeiro, the University of Georgia, Texas, California, my bedroom, planet Earth. Or with this kind of self-referentiality that's typical of Twitter, I found, of course, the predictable references to the platform itself. Abandon all hope, ye who enter this thread. Abandon all hope, ye who follow me. So one of the aspects of the search that was tricky is precisely the way that users play creatively with the quote. So I was trying to nail down the exact search terms so that I could catch a tweet like this one, which plays with the quote to talk about entering hell only to abandon all hope of getting an appointment. What's been the biggest surprise in the Twitter data, though, is the overwhelming popularity of the phrase circle of hell or circles of hell among English language tweets. So in the 12 months of data collection that I was able to complete, the count reached 146,642 tweets, generating an enormous data set of which Sarah and I had only begun to scratch the surface. So by way of comparison, let's consider the Italian phrases, the equivalent Italian phrases, girone dell'inferno or girone infernale, and I'm also searching for their plurals, which in the same period of time produced 19,180 tweets. Let me put these numbers into perspective. If in these 12 months, Italian language users tweeted or retweeted references to the circles of hell on average 52.5 times per day, English language Twitter users did so an astonishing 402 times per day over the course of a year. I think that's like a mind-blowing number to me. I find that disparity shocking for a meme that derives from one of the most prominent artifacts of Italian literary heritage, and this seems to me like the clearest quantifiable evidence for the mimetic spread of Dante's Inferno outside of Dante's direct influence or control. Now, of course, a lot of that has to do with the global dominance of English as lingua franca, especially a phenomenon that is especially exacerbated on social media. And in looking through the data, for example, I saw a couple of ways that the English language numbers are inflated by tweets and retweets among users outside of Anglo-American language contexts. So I happened to be looking at the data in preparation for a conference on the afternoon of Monday, May 8th, 2022, right as the polls were closing in the Philippines, where Ferdinand Marcos Jr. had just been elected as president. The most recent 2,000 tweets in my spreadsheet that day were references to the elections in the Philippines, with only a few exceptions. The vast majority of those were retweets of a single tweet posted by user @DiscoJerdy, who simply wrote, quote, "Ninth circle of hell, parentheses, Philippines." @DiscoJerdy deleted the tweet the following day, presumably because it went so viral that the user must have found their phone pinging throughout the day and night with retweets and likes. I don't have an image of it, but I caught the original tweet in my data set. That tweet, which was one of, I'd say, dozens that correlated the circles of hell to the elections in the Philippines, was liked approximately 13,000 times and retweeted by some 1,800 users before it was deleted. You can see the spike in the data circled in red on this slide. So a similar spike in the data happened just days after the date range that I had selected to focus on today, when a user tweeted similarly about the Nigerian elections in September 2022. Other viral tweets have spiked the numbers on various dates. I've now found 3 distinct tweets using the term circle of hell in reference to K-pop legends BTS, whose international armies can send retweet numbers skyrocketing. In fact, I think the largest spike on the top slide, the top image there, that one in like late March, early April, if I remember correctly, that's to do with BTS. So you might have imagined, as you might have expected, I mean, over the course of the last year of my data collection, I began to find more and more tweets appearing in the data set that reference Elon Musk. I don't have any numerical or comparative data on this, so at this point it's just a hunch, but anecdotally it seems that the discourse in my data sets took on a decidedly more political tone. It had always been political before that, but there had also frequently, in fact more frequently, been references to things like airports and transportation hubs, raising children or dealing with exes, more quotidian subjects that had always been part of the Dantean mimetic landscape. But there was this kind of political coalescing of the language around Musk and the takeover of Twitter in the last couple of months that I was collecting the data. And then on April 3rd, my tag sheets abruptly stopped collecting data. It seems that X had changed the API so that researchers no longer had access to the data in the same way. Fortunately, my data are collected, and I have about 19 months of tweets to comb through, so what I'm trying to do now is to find the right ways of reading all these data through what Sarah and I were thinking about as what she called a zoomable lens, so modes of reading that would allow us to zoom out on the data through quantitative research methods in order to then zoom back in on them through close reading. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip that piece of the discussion since it's the part of the work that's most in progress and has the least clear results. But I just want to say quickly that one of the things that came out of our conversations as we were trying to apply distant reading methods to Twitter data is how ineffective many of the conventional machine reading techniques turned out to be when applied to a corpus, like such a diverse corpus of 140 character bits of text. So I'll skip that part of the discussion. Of course, I'm glad to talk about that further. And I'll conclude just very briefly with a reflection on why I think this kind of work is important, why it's relevant to spend time on these mimetic approaches to the poem, in addition to taking classes like mine and Daniela's, where we'll dig deeply into the poem. With this, I want to return briefly to one of my earlier slides to Lemore Schiffman's characteristics of cultural artifacts that become memes. As expert readers and teachers of Dante's poem, we might look at this list and think that readings that reduce the poem to these features have gotten something fundamentally wrong about the text, something that we as teachers and guides need to correct. But I want to suggest a different approach to the set of knowledge that popular audiences bring to this poem. I want to suggest that these mimetic ways of thinking about the text to reflect on the sins of 21st century society by, say, proposing additional circles of hell or consigning new groups or individuals to Dante's original 9 circles, that such a practice instead fulfills one of the very functions of the text's unique weaving of history together with its allegory. When we treat the text as a puzzle in need of completion along the lines of Schiffman's memeable cultural artifacts, we think through the poem's figures, its characters, its spaces, to perform an assessment of how these virtues and vices translate to local contexts that are foreign to Dante's own. This was part of our discussion yesterday. In this way, memes like these offer alternative forms of reading and interpreting, I'm using those verbs very loosely, the poem's call to self-interrogation and to the critique of local and contemporary power according to a transhistorical, transcultural standard of justice. So I'd like to suggest that we instead utilize our students and our public's mimetic ways of thinking about the text, embracing these mimetic approaches to reflect on their contemporary experience of the world, especially from an ethical standpoint. The poem's memes then become a springboard for exercises in developing the ethical imagination, by which I mean exercises in thinking through analogy about the classification of good and bad ethical behaviors with the guidance of Dante's original schema. Mimetic thinking along the simple, repetitive, humorous lines of the new circles of hell, where the many reasons that one must abandon all hope in 21st century society allow us to do just that. So I'm going to stop there. There's, of course, much more to be said, but I'm very happy to field your questions and especially to hear your comments and suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, are there any questions for Dr. Corbishon? I have plenty, but I'll let you all
There's one in the back. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is China Nellen. I'm a third-year PhD student and a researcher here in the studio. I was really excited by your research. I think it's really cool to look at meme culture and how it reflects literature, particularly literature and language, and how those things overlap. So my questions, I had a basic question I might have missed because I missed the first couple of minutes, is I wonder what software you were using to scrape Twitter.
Yeah.
And then my other question was, when you are looking at your information, are you using tools like Voyant to try and like look at the different ways? Because I know Voyant has like 10 different ways you can look at the way the words are. So I was just wondering like what kind of metrics you're looking at to try and to compare them. And then you also talked about culture and diversity, right? So like even within the United States, when we look at that, the way that they're talking about it around the Philippines, and then you said there was another way that they were using it in another culture?
After the Nigerian election.
Yes, right? I wonder what the cultural difference is between talking about it for the Nigerian election as opposed to the Philippines, right?
Yeah.
Are you looking at things of that nature, or are you just looking at like the overarching similarities?
Yeah, so I'll start with the last question, then I'll get to the other two, which are a little more straightforward. The last question is a really complicated one, right? Like, all of this is being filtered through English language use, because I'm an English and Italian speaker. I don't speak every other possible language, right? So I can't, and I also can't search with every possible language. So I did searches in English and I did searches in Italian. I did a handful in Spanish, because, you know, I can read enough of Spanish to be able to make my way through tweets.
Yes.
And then obviously I have help from colleagues and whoever. Like, I think that's the coolest thing about working in DH is that you're always collaborating with lots of other cool people who are smarter than you are in so many different ways. But okay, so the cross-cultural thing is really tricky, and you know, primarily with memes, with Dante memes, it's so superficial. You know, it's like the Nigerian elections. Nigeria is the ninth circle of hell, or whatever. The Philippines are the ninth circle of hell. People mean very different things when they say that, right? And all I have access to is 140 characters of a tweet, so I have no idea. I gave this talk once, and somebody asked me about satire, and like, I don't know if at Disco Jerdy was saying satirically that the Philippines are the ninth circle of hell, or if that user meant that very sincerely, right? Like, I have no access to it besides what's written there for me. And so, getting to your second question about Voyant, that's where, you know, distant reading tools can come in.
Okay.
We ran a couple, like using Voyant, we ran a couple of, we applied a couple of techniques. So we started with sentiment analysis, which like didn't reveal a whole lot, because like if you're tweeting about the circles of hell, you're probably feeling negative feelings, right? Like it was sort of like obvious, you know? And then we also used, what was the other thing that we did? We used topic modeling. And topic modeling, I think, could produce some really interesting stuff, but even with topic modeling, it's really hard because you've got, you know, 147,000 very diverse bits of 140 character text. And so the topic, like, I thought the topic modeling was going to be like all politics, especially 2021, 2022. I thought it was just going to be Donald Trump and Joe Biden in the English language tweets, and, you know, like Brexit and whatever else. And instead it was like the topic modeling was a lot to do with transportation. Like there's a lot of like airports and you know, traffic and
Which actually makes sense, that's funny.
yeah, but like the topic modeling was kind of all over the place, and so it was like, okay, that's not quite right either. Like I can get some interesting data out of this, but like, is that really leading me in the direction I want to go? I don't know.
Cool.
So I'm still trying to, like, I'm trying to just talk to people smarter than me about like what methods I can use to read tweets. And I did give this talk to an audience. There's a political scientist in the audience who said that the political scientists are using all kinds of cool distant reading methods to read tweets specifically. So I just need to like sit down with more people.
Awesome.
Your very first question was about the platform that I used to do the search in.
Yes.
It's called Tags, Twitter archiving Google Sheets, but it no longer works because Twitter is no longer Twitter.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, yeah.
Yes, so I'm Cheyenne Roy, I'm actually the assistant director in the studio. So I've been running around, and there is pizza back there whenever we conclude our Q&A part. But I was wondering if you noticed like greater cultural trends where, you know, maybe the Dante references come out more to sort of explain or reflect someone's personal feelings on a cultural, socio-political zeitgeist versus just like something that's maybe bothering them constantly, or if the circles of hell do actually match up with what was implied in the Divine Company. But I was wondering if maybe that sort of international understanding of what the 9 circles of hell are is something that you noticed across the board. I think that look at all languages, but you mentioned with like the K-pop group BTS, that's Korean.
Yeah.
So
And for some reason, there's like on the Dante Today archive, we have I don't know, a weird smattering of K-pop references. Like different K-pop groups make reference to Dante, especially in their music videos or like album covers. Not so much lyrically, as far as I can tell, at least. But you know, again, I don't speak Korean, so I don't know. So it really varies from culture to culture, right? Like obviously in Europe, there's much more like deep engagement with the actual text, and there's a little bit less like memetic spread. It's more, I mean, there's still spread, but it's less like superficial and gliding away from the poem. It's really grounded in the poem. Outside of Europe, it really depends. So in the U.S., it's or in the UK also, it's, you know, it kind of runs the gamut, right? So you see like some authors, poets, people like Laura Goodison who are deeply engaged with the poem, who have read it backwards and forwards 100 times, who are really thinking about Dante as an interlocutor. And then you get like, there was a, which fast food company was it? I think it was like Taco Bell ran a 9 Circles of Hell, or no, it wasn't Taco Bell, it was Jack in the Box ran a 9 Circles of Hell like marketing campaign to promote something they called the jalapeno burger.
Oh, yeah.
You know, there's all kinds of like superficial, just like runs that weird gamut around other cultures. In Italy, it's really like Dante is Dante, right? He's like father of the Italian language, and then it kind of migrates outside of that. Yeah, I mean, most of the data that I have come from, like in Latin America, it tends to be a lot of Italian immigrants who are still thinking about Dante as father of the Italian language, right? Sommo poeta, that they like, feel this deep connection to. So it varies, it depends on the culture that you're looking at.
So like the first thing you wouldn't necessarily know is university.
Exactly, I know, like I was not expecting to find the citations that I found in East Asia, for example. That's surprising. There is a tradition of reading and translating Dante in East Asia. There's an upcoming conference on Dante in Asia that the University of Notre Dame is putting on. But like the engagement is like less well known outside of that region. I think the Middle East is probably a very fruitful space for engagement, but like I don't know anything about it yet. I haven't found many sightings at all from that region. There's much more in Africa that's yet to be discovered. I had a student do a really cool project about where she's from Eritrea, which is a former Italian colony, and she was looking at like how do the former Italian colonies think about their relationship to their colonizer through the perspective of the colonizer's greatest poet.
And it may even be a bigger spread depending on may or may not have access to abuse Twitter during that period.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm just like, the Twitter stuff is just a small sliver, you know, just a tiny sliver of it. Yeah. Maria?
Yeah, so going back to Dante Today, to
Yeah.
your site and your archival work on that, I was wondering if you could tell us a little more about the crowdsourcing project
Oh, sure.
and the selection process that
Yeah.
goes into that, because you receive submissions, and I guess my biggest question is, how much of that data that is crowdsourced do you actually keep? Is there a lot that you eliminate, or I'd like to know?
There's very little that we eliminate. I mean, when we talk about crowdsourcing it, or when we talk about receiving submissions from around the world, we do absolutely 100% receive submissions around the world, but it's not like we're inundated. There's a kind of steady trickle. So we get, you know, wonderful professors like Daniela who instruct her students to use Dante Today and then submit things if we don't have them. And then we'll get like an influx of things from University of Arkansas students. Or there was a high school teacher in Jacksonville, Florida who, like her students sent us a bunch of things all of a sudden. And so we get kind of like bursts of activity. But otherwise, it's just sort of a steady trickle. So we received through the submission form, we heard from a couple of filmmakers. There was a recent PBS documentary about Dante's life, and they really wanted their stuff to be featured on that site. And I guess absolutely. There's like an adult film filmmaker who sent us some Dante-related stuff that we posted. We'd sort of received things. It was like a curator in Brazil who sent us a few things, and then just like some fans of Dante's around the world. A lot of them are just like people that we know. Like my husband has sent some things. My colleague's husband has sent some things.
Very different from the Twitter thing.
Totally different. Yeah.
And kind of a follow-up on that, do you
Yeah.
think there's hope that maybe the